try to develop a little bit of a different perspective of what's going on this campus, particularly from an ecological or environmental viewpoint. Now, FIU is a university, and as such, in my opinion, it needs to be a model of environmental sustainability. That is, it should not only be teaching and doing research environmentally, it should also be operating environmentally, and that means the campus landscape and buildings. How we operate our buildings and how we landscape our grounds should be part of the educational process. Continue to demonstrate what is the best way to go about doing this so we can move toward a more sustainable planet. Now, this particular spot is considered one of the most beautiful spots on campus. In fact, the background here was featured in a national magazine which was promoting FIU as a very beautiful campus. Now, one of the things that we want to do in this presentation is get people to think a little bit differently than they ordinarily do. Think a little bit more ecologically. And this is a good example. What you have here is a lake which can either be positive or negative for environmental reasons. It's important that we talk about water issues because in South Florida, we are not only in a short-term drought situation, we have a long-term water supply problem. And what we need to do is not only have adequate water supply, we also need to reduce pollution. Now, the scene that you see right here is an example of some bad landscaping. One of the worst things we have done on this campus is expand lawns as far as the eye can see. We've sort of designed the campus almost as a golf course. Now, that is the worst example of landscaping from a water point of view. It requires significant irrigation during the worst times, during the drought times. It uses tremendous amounts of fertilizers and pesticides, which not only utilize fossil fuel in making them, but also end up polluting the water. This particular lake is an example of a eutrophic lake, which means it has high nutrient content. It's not surprising. What you see is where we've planted lawn right down to the edge of the lake. And so when you're fertilizing and putting on pesticides, that will go right into the lake, and by the way, right into the aquifer, which is at the same level approximately as the lake, and that's our water supply in South Florida. So we're really polluting our drinking supply by doing this. We also do have a beautiful library, but I will tell you that historically it's on at 5 a.m. at night. Now, we are in a process, that's in my opinion, that's very wasteful to be having tremendous amount of lights and all the electricity use, and it's very costly for the university. Now, we are at this point in the university's life, we have some exciting things that may be changing. The president, just this year, signed the American University's President's Climate Initiative, which is designed to make the campus more sustainable, and in particular to dramatically reduce CO2 emissions, which means that, like the rest of the campus, we need to reduce our greenhouse gases by 80% by 2050. And so one of the new provisions that's just being implemented is they are turning off the lights at about 3 a.m. I would like to see something more strategic. We'll talk about that later. But we also need to very much change the landscaping practices. So we're going to walk around, we're going to take a look at some of the landscaping practices and see how we can make them more environmental. A good first example of how we do landscaping is right here. What you see is a palm tree. It's just been fertilized, and it's right there. As soon as the rains come, they will both wash down the slope as well as go down into the ground and then get into the water, and therefore causing eutrophication, which reduces the oxygen levels. Now, we do have fountains in the lake which do partially address that. They aerate the lake, and so they do make for a healthier lake environment. However, what I would point out, another thing we should be doing, it's okay to have the fountains. They're aesthetic. It's a nice thing to have. But what we also should be doing is using this as an opportunity to use solar energy. On some campuses, they have solar energy powered fountains that would work just as well and demonstrate to students some of the wide varieties of uses of solar energy. Another point about it is we certainly shouldn't be running these fountains on windy days, because we're then contributing to water evaporation, and it reduces our water supply in South Florida. Okay, now in general, what we should be doing more of is planting shade trees all over the campus. This is an example of the best tree for South Florida. This is a live oak. It's the most environmental tree. It provides a nice shade. It requires the least care. It doesn't blow over in hurricanes. It attracts wildlife, and it's drought resistant. All of those are the kinds of things we should be looking for in our landscape. And so this concept is either ecological landscaping or xeriscaping, which specifically means planting plants that require less water during the dry season. Now, we also should be doing other things with the plants. One example is right here. They have absolutely no mulch. They have actually swept all of the leaves away because they think it is clean looking and it's sterilized. But what we should be doing is putting heavy layers of mulch in a circle around the tree, a wide circle that will encourage the root growth to go out, that will allow moisture to be retained, and will make the roots expand, protecting you in a hurricane. So we're doing just the wrong thing. They actually go around here and cut any roots that are near the surface to keep anything from going away from the grass edge and make it look neat, but they're actually harming the tree and not promoting the health of the tree. Another aspect that I want to emphasize about shade trees is they can serve two other functions, or at least three other functions. One is if they're planted in the right spot, like this oak tree back here, where the canopy almost reaches the building, they significantly shade the walls of the building. Therefore, they're significantly reducing the air conditioning required in that building. This is one of the few, and we do have it in the right location. There used to be two more, but they've actually been removed. One of them got damaged, so that's unfortunate. But it would also want to emphasize how a palm tree doesn't really provide that shade. So that palm tree may be a little bit interesting, but what we should emphasize is planting shade trees near the buildings to reduce the air conditioning. The other use you can see along here is we should have shade trees along every walkway on this campus that will then shade the students as they're walking between buildings and between classes, as well as protect them a little bit in a rainstorm. So you're really providing an area that's more pleasant for walking, particularly in very hot, humid South Florida, where you have a more shaded environment. The third thing that these shade trees do, if we were to plant them all over the campus, when we have a massive rainstorm, it will reduce flooding. It will reduce what they call stormwater drainage, which can overload our sewage system and cause additional pollution. So shade trees offer all of those kind of things. They cool the campus, not just the building. They reduce stormwater runoff and provide, of course, a much more pleasant environment.
So don't they help with windstorms as well? Like a hurricane, helping protect windows?
They can protect, if they're done right, particularly when they're planted in groups. They can protect a house. My house was protected in Hurricane Andrew from having a whole bunch of trees on one side of my house. So it can, but it depends on where they're planted and what kind of tree.
So they created as a windbreaker?
They can reduce the wind impact on a building, which can reduce the air conditioning, yes.
Whenever you're ready.
This is an example of landscaping that we should be doing instead of planting grass. This is a butterfly garden. that is both aesthetic, has pretty flowering plants, as you can see. They're designed to attract butterflies and even be hosts for the larvae. And the students can learn an awful lot about the whole biological process of butterflies and how they play such a significant role. So it's really an educational tool. It's a good example of how you can use the landscape to actually educate students on ecological topics.
Would these species fare well next to a live oak tree?
Not necessarily underneath it, because most of these plants need some sun. Now, it's planted actually in a somewhat shady spot, so it doesn't need a lot of light, and if it's a fairly thin live oak, it could be underneath it, but usually you want them a little bit more in the open, and that's where you have the grass, so it can replace the grass. Now let's switch the topic to transportation on campus and to the campus, because that's one of the most important environmental topics. Because as you probably know, every time we drive a mile, we produce about a pound of carbon dioxide, which is the major greenhouse gas. Now, this university is primarily a commuter campus, so we have a tremendous amount of car traffic to the campus and even on the campus. And we really need to change how we're doing that. We need to see how we can reduce that automobile use as a part of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, one of the first things we have is we have many students jogging. There's one right there, jogging on the campus, walking on the campus, riding bikes on the campus, and we need to make a safer, more efficient atmosphere for that. Right now, he's jogging on the main road. A car is coming by. That's an extremely dangerous situation. What we have done is we've made our major beltway loop as dangerous as it can be. We not only don't have any bike path or jog path or walking path next to the road, we have actual barriers that mean that a bicyclist, if he had to go off the road, would have an accident. So we put up barriers to keep people from protect the grass, but in fact endangering the students. Many times I've had to park over on that parking lot and had to walk along the road with massive number of cars coming by with absolutely zero shoulder to safely walk. That's one of the major things we need to change. But it is also a change in the mentality. We need to make the campus much more efficient and safe for people walking and biking. We shouldn't design the campus around the automobile, all right? Now, behind us you see a parking garage. A couple of things about that. First of all, you can see the lights in the daylight in the parking area, which do not need to be on, so it's a total waste. I call that day lighting. We instead need to use the other kind of day lighting. We need design for a parking garage or any of the buildings that use natural lighting and have the lights off when there's enough natural light. And that could be, by the way, during most of the daytime in as simple a structure as a parking garage. There are ways to do that with actually little use of lighting. If we do, it should be highly efficient LED lighting, which is being used in parking garages in many cities around the world. In addition, we need to try to redesign the parking situation. We need to make the parking spaces smaller. We need to actually have preferred parking for compact cars and for highly efficient hybrid vehicles or carpooling. We need to have favored treatment